There's an excitement about going to someone's house for the first time, and most of us don't just stand uninvited in the corner of people's bedrooms. So we're getting payback for Bella's infringed privacy, and we're going to virtually tour Edward Cullen's house with fresh lamb eyes to see what this lion's den is all about. But wait, I'm in the Pacific Northwest, and something doesn't feel right. That's better. It's a love story as old as time, and by time I mean 2005 AD. Bella, also known as Your Name, is a girl with brown hair. But the most sinister pale boy at school smelled your period, and now he wants to bring you home to meet his siblings, who are all dating. His parents didn't adopt another girl. If they did, there wouldn't be an opening for you. So let's enjoy the Edward Cullen Open Door AD Tour. Hi AD, I'm Edward Cullen. Welcome to my treehouse in Forks, Washington. When I was editing this, I could not understand why they made him take off her sweater. She puts in all the work. What is the temperature of a vampire's home? Because unless it's 80 degrees, you should keep on both sweaters. It's not worth the hassle. Edward Cullen is the epitome of I'm not like other vampires.
What did you expect?
Coffins, dungeons, and moats?
Dungeons and moats?
No, not the moats.
Not the moats.
Okay, well, I kind of wanted a gargoyle. I maybe expected like a gothic revival. Maybe a second empire if you were feeling basic. At least a Queen Anne. But the Cullens don't like things from the 1800s despite being a group of people from the 1800s. So instead we have a home that could either be owned by a coven of vampires or a Nike executive. In my research, I saw a lot of articles comparing this house to Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. And to be honest, I don't really see it. You can trust me on this because I did a whole book report on Frank Lloyd Wright in the 7th grade. And after finding out that his whole family was murdered in a house that he built, I only talked about that and I did not look into his architecture. But since then I have done more research, and the comparison of Frank Lloyd Wright tells us more about how few modern architects have had their work recognized. To me, this house is pulling inspiration from the modern architecture movement and architects like Frank Lloyd Wright or the Eames who were exploring that connection between non-natural materials and the natural world. Modern architecture can be confusing because the word modern can mean a lot of different things, but modern architecture doesn't mean a house that's new. It's referring to a building style that was happening in the early 1900s to the 80s. Just like Victorian is a style, there are types of Victorians within it, like a Second Empire, Queen Anne, stick, shingle. So inside the style of modern architecture, you might find Bauhaus, Art Deco, or Brutalism. And something to keep in mind, it's always easier to see the trends when you're further away from it. I think in this case, modern and Victorian architecture are really good to compare because of how different they are. Victorian is fully about adornment, details. Sure, you could put a board on the edge of a roof, but what if you carved patterns and flowers into it and made it a little tiara for your house? Victorian houses are maximalism to the extreme. So in true pendulum fashion, modern architecture wants to distance itself from the overly ornate. Modern homes are often associated with minimalism. And at the time, as the technology for glass, steel, concrete increased, so did the possibilities. The earliest US colonizer homes in the 1600s had to have glass shipped from Europe, which meant windows were small, and to be as efficient with the materials possible, the panes were diamond shaped. But with advancements in glass production in the 1900s, you could have floor-to-ceiling windows. And this house, built in 2001 in Portland, Oregon, is playing with these same modern themes. A floating second story, floor-to-ceiling windows, a combination of wood, concrete, glass, and steel. The house was designed by Jeff Covell, and it was the first building he built with his architecture firm, Skylab, which does sound like something out of The 100. If you're terminally online like me, you might remember the Tumblr meme saying that Twilight wouldn't exist without 9/11 because Stephenie Meyer was inspired by the band My Chemical Romance, who formed in response to 9/11. But that is not our only connection to 9/11. This house was originally built for a buyer who was based in New York, and after 9/11, the sale fell through. The architect then moved into the house that he designed and built until he could get another buyer within the year. They then sold it 5 years later to Nike's chief design officer, John Hoke. It was then the Hoke family who agreed to let this house be a filming location for Twilight. So that's a fun fact you can remember me by. On Skylab's website, they call it the Hoke House, possibly because Vampire House just doesn't fit. But I always think it's interesting to see what an architecture firm is putting out, like what are they most proud of? They clearly like the floating second floor. Who doesn't? And in their description, they talk about the smaller building footprint that gives a floating forested treehouse experience. And I think that was clearly important to the movie too. For a movie completely set in the woods, they really wanted to show the woods. Before we talk about the inside, I kind of want to go back to Stephenie Meyer's original description. In the Twilight book, the house is kind of described as a mix of historic and contemporary. The house was timeless, graceful, and probably 100 years old. It was painted a soft faded white, 3 stories tall, rectangular, and well proportioned. The windows and doors were either part of the original structure or a perfect restoration. I feel like she could very much be describing a colonial revival. Built in the early 1900s, yes. Rectangular, very much so. 3 stories tall, sometimes yes. Painted white, for a revival that's almost a guarantee. But her description of the inside adds way more intrigue. The inside was even more surprising, less predictable than the exterior. It was very bright, very open, and very large. This must have originally been several rooms, but the walls had been removed from most of the first floor to create one wide space. Do the Cullens know about load-bearing walls? Presumably yes. The back south-facing wall had been entirely replaced with glass, and beyond the shade of the cedars, the lawn stretched bare to the wide river. The walls, the high-beam ceilings, the wooden floors, and the thick carpets were all varying shades of white. That's right, vampires with only white carpets. I only wear black during my period. But in case you haven't pieced this all together, it would probably look like this. Or maybe this. I have actually seen an older all-white house. I recorded a podcast at the home of Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner. They were trying to imitate the loft and gallery spaces that they had in New York. But in my bonus episode for the podcast, I found out that Lee Krasner kind of regretted taking out the walls and removing so much of the Victorian character. But they also had a pretty good reason. They were trying to make all of the focus on their art. And although the Cullens might be able to create a gory Jackson Pollock painting, their reasoning for having an all-white interior seems more focused on who they aren't than who they are. They aren't in love with the interior design of the MoMA. They are just intentionally repelling the traditional vampire aesthetic. Even if this house chosen isn't exactly what was described in the books, it's newer, it's less classical, it's less white, it still manages to fit the bill of not like other vampires. The house doesn't have boarded up windows or heavy curtains to keep out the light. Instead, the whole house is windows. They don't sleep in coffins, they just don't sleep. They aren't surrounded by 100 years worth of stuff, but instead live in a house as empty as Bella's mind, according to Edward. This also brings us to what I find so unnerving about the Cullens and this house. They don't have to do any of this. Edward is regulating his every movement, so he doesn't move too quickly or listen too much or sparkle. It sounds like a pretty torturous existence to constantly be masking your true self. When he brings Bella to his house, he says this is the only place we can be ourselves. But by bringing her here, he is just inviting her to a place where he can be himself and then restraining him and his family to act more human. And not to put too sharp a tooth on it, but why is this family torturing themselves to be so involved in Forks? There are dear a lot of places. They have enough people in their family to play any board game. And video games do exist. And most importantly, they have money. Despite how much Edward Cullen doesn't want to be like other vampires, there is one thing he won't give up to be different. And that's wealth. The community of Forks is supposed to be uncertain about the Cullens because on some level, they know that they're vampires. But I think the community might just be sensing another type of vampire. Forks is a working class town. The median income for a household is $35,000. And about 4,000 people live here. You can imagine that this family of 7 that moves into this $2+ million house that's on the land that formerly belonged to the Quileute people, it might get some well-deserved side-eye. So let's go inside this house, brought to you by Generational Wealth, but they are all the generations. Going back to the Skylab website, there is a big bedroom with an attached office. And when I see a bookcase, I do a little snooping. They've got modern architecture A to Z, and even more interesting, they have a collection of art and architecture magazine, like reprints. It was a magazine that ran from the 40s to the 60s. And thank you to this house because that made me do some research and I found out that you can access every single one of the magazines in PDF form on their website. I'll put it down below. They don't show photos of other rooms that were in the movie, which means I think it's time for us to pull an Edward and go look inside his room. A room with so many possessions, but still so little personality. There's a 1940s record player radio console, a flat screen TV, books, a CD collection. Oh, and I almost forgot, a chaise lounge. Just imagine being alive long enough to have seen chaise lounges that looked like this, and then going out of your way to have this. While I was editing, I realized I should probably do a bit more research before I absolutely dunk on this innocent seat. It was designed by this guy, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and Lily Reich in Germany. They were both involved in the Bauhaus movement, but this piece was not really designed for everyday people. It's called the Barcelona couch, and you can buy the real deal starting at $14,000 on the Knoll website. I can kind of believe that Edward Cullen might not mind a couch like this because he is perpetually 17 without aches and pains, but Ludwig was 66 when he designed this. Okay, back to my dream couch. I don't think Edward Cullen would ever allow himself the passionate embrace of a couch like this. And that gets to the meat of what makes regular vampires so fun and Edward Cullen so sad. He is trying so hard to be human that he completely misses all the fun flamboyance that's supposed to come with being a vampire. Dracula doesn't wear a coat, he wears a cape. The Vampires expansion in The Sims 4, it includes 4 different fences because they knew that Vladdy Daddy deserves not only details, but options. Count Von Count doesn't just count, he counts with an accent.
Ah, that's one. One bet.
Somehow Edward Cullen manages to suck the life out of what it means to be a vampire. And he also sucks the life out of his pretty cool house. I really want to blame Edward Cullen for trying to distance himself so much from traditional vampire taste. But I think we've all been kind of guilty of repelling things that we actually like because we don't want to be exactly what people expect. It's the reason I read every single Twilight book in high school, but did not tell anyone. It's the reason I went to every single movie premiere and acted like I had been abducted. It's embarrassing that I couldn't just embrace it. And I wish Edward Cullen could have embraced who he truly wanted to be instead of embracing a minor. Shout out to Victoria 4 who wanted me to talk about modern exteriors, and I somehow twisted the question so I could talk about Twilight. Tell me your thoughts in the comments on this house and other vampire houses. I want to have a conversation with you about this. If you like this, like it, but also check out this video I did on witch houses in movies and TV. I think our interests might align. I'd love for you to subscribe, and thank you all for coming here.
Yeah, this is my room.